everybody, and welcome back to Devils United. Back again with Ben, a fantastic journalist. Ben, how are you doing?
Very good, Maisy. How are you? Good to be here.
Good to see you as well. I'm very well, thank you. Looking forward to having a bit of a chat with you, learning a little bit more things as well regarding things that we about ownerships the summer as well. So, and I think it'd be great to catch up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the ownership process is certainly making a lot of headlines at the moment. And by the end of the season, we're likely to have a clearer picture. So delving into it is going to be relatively twofold. I think first, Manchester United fans should always understand the process. And then second of all, who the suitors are. And then obviously all of this is informed as well by whether or not the Glazers genuinely want to sell. But the fact that they've put the two public outright bidders through to stage 2 is obviously positive and a hint in some respects that they will, for the right valuation, entertain a full sale offer. But there's still multiple suitors and there's still quite a long way to go, including all of that due diligence as well. So we can obviously chat about the specifics, the Qatar bid, the Sir Jim Ratcliffe one, some of the minority investors as well. But I think at the back of everyone's mind, you have to understand how this very rigid process is structured. And it is obviously a business transaction and not a takeover in the traditional sense, because it's a tender-like process that requires you to jump through hurdles. Whereas if it was a takeover in a more, I suppose, normal sense, you would have a 9-month period, you would have a singular suitor, and there wouldn't necessarily be the same rigid steps needed. And then, of course, we shouldn't look at this like a transfer either, because it isn't just about bidding and then being the highest and then winning in a quick sense. There's a lot more finesse to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and we've heard quite a few ones linked as well, being Qatar, being Jim Ratcliffe, and I'm sure there was there Elliott's as well, I believe, who was wanting to who wanted to invest into the club.
Well, we have minority investors or partners, and then of course the two public known outright bids, and on top of that there is a third group from America as well, who at the moment have chosen to stay secret, and that's very normal. During the Chelsea takeover, also run by the Rain group, we had 4 put through, 3 went public, 1 didn't, and the 4th bidding group turned out to be Steve Pagliuca, who's the co-owner of Atlanta and also the Boston Celtics, and he hasn't denied that he's interested in Manchester United, but we shouldn't read too much into that, because it was very similar with Liverpool when he was asked about them, and he's not believed to be bidding for that particular football club, but he's coy because it can be in the interests of a number of business people and their organizations to simply not comment and kind of fuel the fire a little bit. But Steve Pagliuca and some of the other Chelsea bidders, Mohamed Al Khawaji from Saudi Arabia, and in addition to that, some believe Harris Blitzer, who partnered with Sir Martin Broughton to buy Chelsea but were unsuccessful. Those type of names have inquired to differing degrees, but it's unclear at this stage if they've formally tabled anything. And certainly in the case of Al Khawaji, who's from Saudi Arabia, nothing appears to be there at this point. And with Harris Blitzer and with Steve Pagliuca, they're silent and they're coy. But we know that there's more than just the two that have gone public. With Elliott Sports Management, they're more looking to be a partner to either help the Glazers stay at the club or pair themselves potentially with another group. And you'll find a few like that that are not interested in an outright bid, but have entered into the process and been put through to the second stage with a view to potentially joining forces. And again, we saw this with Chelsea, where Rain Group and individual suitors came together and decided that strength in numbers would give them the best opportunity of winning. So obviously with Harris Blitzer and Sir Martin Broughton, they already knew each other and came together as a joint consortium. But for example, Todd Boehly, who is now the Chelsea owner, had found Clearlake Capital, but not Hans-Jörg Weiss. And Hans-Jörg Weiss had actually independently inquired, and eventually there was a pairing that took place to allow that consortium to bolster. So coming back to Manchester United, what's quite interesting is that with Sheikh Jassim, he has no real need to find any partners. It will come down to whether or not the valuation is met. And if it isn't, then nobody externally can bolster that consortium because they've got the money and the resources and the strategy there to get it done if they want to, which means that if the Glazers stick to a high valuation, they'll either ultimately meet it or walk away. And then with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, he's probably the more likely to take on another investor or partner in some capacity, not because he claims not to have the funds, although obviously there is a question mark about the debt aspect of his bid, but his majority bid, as he calls it, is for 100% of the Glazers stake, which is about 69%. And then, much like Sheikh Jassim, he plans to get to 100% of the club, but to do so, he first and foremost may need more funding or choose to bring on board a partner, because you've still ultimately, to get that 100%, got to spend more money. So when we distinguish between the two bids, in a very superficial way, we can say that Sir Jim Ratcliffe is calling his majority investment, and he's doing that to be precise because the Glazers do not own 100% of the club. Sheikh Jassim says he wants 100% of the club, but both of those bids will have to go through the same process of delisting the public shares in order to buy 100%. And technically it's not guaranteed, but the reason why Sheikh Jassim says 100% is because he believes, and I think rightly, as does Sir Jim Ratcliffe, even though he's not said it, that if the price is good enough for the Glazers, it will be good enough for the public shareholders as well. And then if you get to a point where you get enough of the public shareholders, you can enact something which is called the squeeze out process. And then that forces the rest of them, if you do have those that don't want to sell their shares, to have to surrender them. But first of all, you've got to get to the percentage in order to enact that. And because 69 is not that percentage, it's not technically guaranteed that anybody can own 100% of Manchester United before you have that agreement from both the Glazers and the public shareholders. So that's a convoluted way of trying to explain the difference, but the simpler way is they actually do both want 100% of the football club, even though one's saying majority and one is saying 100%.
So we know that some of the people have passed the stage 1. So what's happening in this stage 2?
Well, stage 2 was always planned. So this is another thing that naturally people ask, particularly on social media: who's the highest bidder? How quickly is it going to happen? Are the Glazers going to stay or go? And in addition to that, what are the plans once any potential group comes in? And obviously, if we're being very simplistic, we can narrow down the suitors, we can explain the valuation, and we can outline the direction of travel. But this isn't a transfer, so it's not going to happen as quickly as people perceive. And even though some reports had suggested end of March, I've been told very clearly and reporting very clearly since January that this is unlikely to happen in any capacity, whether outright majority or minority, before the end of the season. And that's because even if a deal in principle is effectively agreed with a singular suitor, all those final bits still take time. Now, what's true is when the process first started last year, and those that were interested were invited to inquire via the RAIN group, back then it was hopeful that something could happen optimistically around about Easter. But now I think it's clear that it's unlikely anything will get done by the end of March. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist at this point to work out why, because Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Sheikh Jassim haven't even met Manchester United yet as part of stage 2. And they do not have additional information in the data room, which is what you use to get your due diligence done and to a more accurate valuation. And then a bid will be tabled that is far more concrete. And after that, we can have two things happen. One is a singular suitor gets put forwards as the so-called preferred bidder. They enter into an exclusive period. And at that point, you start to realize, first of all, what the Glazers' intention is. And second of all, a deal is far closer. Second thing that could happen, I think it's less likely, is that there's such a credible volume of partners and or outright bidders that the Glazers either decide to put one of each through, a minority bidder and an outright bidder, or potentially two outright bidders, Sheikh Jassim, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, going head to head. And they may do that to create competitive tension and put in one more stage. With Chelsea, because of the high volume of bidders, that's exactly what Rain Group did. They shortlisted 4, and at that point, all 4 were very strong. And then they narrowed them down, and then they tried to, because Roman Abramovich wanted a little bit more, even though he didn't receive the funds, generate a little bit of a bidding war, less about the number and more about pledged investment into the football club, and also getting a binding desire that the majority owner couldn't leave before a 10-year period. And then there was a preferred bidder, that period of exclusivity, and the deal got done pretty quickly. But unlike Chelsea, it takes as long as it takes, because Manchester United's license is not under threat like Chelsea's was, and the Glazers are not being driven out like Roman Abramovich was. So stage 2 is about due diligence. Due diligence normally, even a fast due diligence, would take 2 or 3 months. But some of the information, in fact, a lot of the information about Manchester United, because it's on the New York Stock Exchange and publishers' accounts and so on, is out there. But other aspects won't be, like player clauses, any ongoing contract renewals, projected budgets ahead of next season, commercial deals that are still secretive, but Manchester United maybe have already locked in, anything legal or relating to IP rights, any costs pertaining to the redevelopment of Old Trafford or Carrington. So more sensitive stuff, more player-related stuff, more legal stuff. And on top of that, in your due diligence, you don't just create a valuation based on the numbers that you're given. You appoint an independent valuer in order to sense check everything, and you undertake tax due diligence as well. So there's a whole series of box checks that could be done quickly, but if you don't have the urgency, as in the case of Chelsea, you take your time. And when you take your time, 2 or 3 months could be deemed to be a norm. So let's just say that Rain, as they did with Chelsea, decide this stage of due diligence still has quite a hard deadline, which I think is to be expected. They'll rush that process through, and it may take a month. And prior to that process, there will be presentations which have already happened from last week and will continue over the next 2 weeks or so, with Sir Jim Ratcliffe now and Sheikh Jassim Elliott Sports Management have already held meetings, and they will learn from various senior figures at the clubs what the due diligence will entail in terms of a back and forth and who the points of contact are. And they'll hear presentations from all different departments to work out the direction of travel at the club. And these are almost selling pitches to say to the suitors, here's why you should pay more. Here's why, if you do X, let's just say redevelop Old Trafford or invest in the women's team, you'll gain Y. And the number affiliated to Y is higher than you think at the moment, because we've seen the numbers and you haven't. And then off go the suitors, and they look through the numbers, and they maybe have some back and forth, and then they put in a more concrete offer. And then that number will be far more significant than the indicative offers. And if there's a deadline on that, then there's a variety of variables thereafter, because one could stand out and get put through very quickly, or none could stand out, and then the Glazers could get far more involved and ask for a back and forth that delays it even further. And then eventually we're going to find out 2 things. 1, do the Glazers genuinely want to sell? And 2, has their valuation been met? And if their valuation remains high, is the bluff on behalf of the suitors who have low balls to begin with to get through to stage 2 and are prepared to go up? Or is it the other way around, that all along the Glazers have said this 6 billion or so number, but actually it's always been 5, and as a consequence, the parties are not particularly far apart? And that's obviously only for the Glazers and only for the suitors to know. But stage 2 is about actually seeing the numbers, which means that the offer that is made next is going to be far more significant than the indicative ones, which are really just about getting through to the next stage without showing too much of your hand.
And in terms of transfer, like the possible new ownership at Manchester United, how many stages is there in the whole ownership process?
Well, there could be 3, there could be 4. I wouldn't worry too much about the stages,
Yeah.
but broadly speaking, we can say stage 1 is the indicative offers, although you could obviously say that the actual beginning of this was when people were asked to inquire. But if we call stage 1 the soft deadline, and then stage 2 is due diligence with a secondary offer, which can go up or down, by the way, but in this context, it's far more likely to go up than down. And then stage 3 would be a preferred bidder entering into a period of exclusivity. And then you start to head towards a completion. But there's lots of takeovers where someone enters into a period of exclusivity and that time lapses, or they pull out, or they discover a skeleton in the closet. And when you're moving at speed, it's far more likely that something will be discovered that creates a stumbling block. And that's why when or if a party gets into stage 3, they'll be very conscious in many ways to slow it down. So the power dynamic shifts, because in this part of the process, it's all about what Rain Group and the Glazers want to do. If they say that the deadline's tomorrow to submit an offer, then as a suitor, you become worried that your rival will do exactly that. So you have to get a move on. Whereas once you're a singular bidder in a period of exclusivity, you basically know that the Glazers have, in theory, picked you, and you're not that far unless a deal is very possible. And as a result, if you choose to slow it down from the perspective of the suitor because you believe that more due diligence is needed, or there's a stumbling block over the price, or your independent valuer has said actually the projections around an Old Trafford redevelopment are off, you can go off and re-crunch those numbers and try and haggle over the finer parts of the price. And there's nothing really that the football club can do, especially not unless they have a backup bidder. And I don't think it will be the case in this context, because if the Glazers sell outright, it's relatively unlikely that anybody is going to top the valuation of the Qatar bid, unless Sir Jim Ratcliffe ends up offering the Glazers an ability to stay, or says that he only wants the 69%, but finds a partner to come in and add funds to match whatever they believe the Qatar number is. But it is highly likely that Qatar's bid will be the highest if the Glazers go down the route of an outright sale, which means if they're the ones that were to enter into a period of exclusivity, there's no real leverage left for the Glazers at that point, because to say to Qatar, if your exclusivity period expires, we're going to invite Sir Jim Ratcliffe back in, Qatar would probably know all along that they've got a higher valuation on the football club than Sir Jim Ratcliffe. So there's a dynamic here. And obviously what the Glazers are trying to do at the moment is flip the narrative to get all the suitors to bid against each other, and even against mystery bidders as well, to try and get everyone on the same page almost. So then if the valuation is equal, they can create a bidding war and competitive tension. But as long as you get a scenario where you basically just have minority bidders and then a couple of outright bidders that are known, and their valuations are all still much lower than the Glazers, at that point, it's really difficult for the Glazers to create a kind of bidding war over price, especially before due diligence, because both the public groups that have said they're bidding outright have stuck to their strategies, have stuck to their valuation, because they believe it's already above Manchester United's market value. So it's fantastic from the Glazers' perspective, which is why they're sticking to their guns to try and get the best possible deal, which means that if one of them is put through, the other one in all likelihood will have a lower valuation, or they would both get put through, and then they try and create more of a bidding war, or one will get put through and then the other will just lose interest and walk away because they'll realize it's not attainable. Whereas with Chelsea, there were 4 put through and about 9 credible suitors. So it's much easier for Rain Group at that point to constantly keep people in the race and pit them against each other, and have all of these urgent deadlines out of both competitive tension but also need, because Chelsea simply had to be sold due to Abramovich and the war in Ukraine. So it's quite an interesting dynamic here. And I suppose the last thing that's worth pointing out is even a minority bidder must go through the same process. So Elliott Sports Management don't want the club, but they still have to value 100% of the club. They still have to undertake the same due diligence. And if the Glazers get a minority owner that they don't want, that values the club highly, they can still use that with the outright bidders to say there's someone in this race that's hit that 6 billion number. And that might create pressure as well. So it's very complex because you're not dealing with only one type of bid. You can have commercial and media rights offers, you can have minority offers, you can have majority offers, you can have outright offers, and everyone coming in will value the club. And the Glazers are not a unified family either at this point. So the S in Glazers is very significant. They don't know what they want to do yet, and they won't know what they want to do until the next round of offers, and they have an opportunity to discuss it as a family. And we all know that Avram and Joel are more connected to the club than the other 4 siblings. So it's a very difficult and complex process that could move fast in takeover terms. But I wouldn't, if I was a fan, get overly sucked into this day by day, blow by blow, transfer like narrative. Because it's very easy for someone to come out and say, Qatar are the favourites. Qatar are going to spend tons of money at the club. Qatar are confident in winning, and Qatar want to get it done by the end of March. But at this stage in the process, it's just nonsense. And of course, if Qatar win, somebody will celebrate and say, I was right all along. Of course, if Qatar get it done quicker than expected, somebody will turn around and say, isn't it the case that they were always likely to take over Manchester United? But there's multiple suitors in the race, and the 2 main outright bidders have not even heard a single presentation from Manchester United and have not undertaken any due diligence at the time we're recording it. All they've done is write 1 email and 1 paragraph with 1 indicative offer and proof of funds. And that is pretty much it as far as direct engagement with Manchester United and Rain Group. So now the process starts in earnest, and yet we are hearing these whispers and stories of who's going to win and how quickly they're going to win. And anybody can put 2 and 2 together and say Qatar are ambitious and Qatar are confident and Qatar are rich. And of course, all of these things are true. But it doesn't mean that at this point they're guaranteed victory. It might be the case, but it's not particularly responsible journalism to preempt and guess how the process might pan out when the meetings and the due diligence haven't even started.
Absolutely. I'm myself as a Manchester United fan, I've been feeling the exact same thing as how you mentioned, that I don't want to get too hopeful because you hear so many reports like, oh, the takeover is going to be done by the end of March. And I've thought to myself, because it's got to have a load of legal documentation that we're not going to be aware of, and it's just going to I thought it's easily going to take a year, in my opinion, for the takeover to be done. And I think I think because of all you've probably seen the protests and everything online of how Manchester United fans feel, and I think as soon as you've heard it, a lot of people got automatically quite happy that it is going to be taken over sooner rather than later. But we've seen as well, like Qatar, for instance, there's reports with them saying that they're not going to be bidding over a certain over the odds. And them saying that, do you feel like that was more genuine or more smart tactics in terms of trying to win Manchester United with the Glazers?
Well, there'll always be gamesmanship. Those trying to buy the club will stick to their strategy and valuation, and those trying to sell the club will try and hold out for the highest possible price, which is why I said before, it's about who's bluffing, or whether or not actually after the due diligence, the parties will have more agreement on what they think is a fair valuation. Qatar simply, and also Sir Jim Ratcliffe and any suitor, it's impossible for them to get to an accurate valuation. So the Glazers have got the upper hand because they're the ones that have seen the numbers, and they entered into this process with Rain Group because Joe Ravitch, who is one of the founders of Rain, told them that he believed around 6 or 6.5 billion was very possible, and even potentially more than that, which is why this very large bracket of 6 to 8 billion is being bandied around. But that is also tactical, because you're not going to go in and put a low price on a club like Manchester United, especially not off the back of the Chelsea sale and seeing the volume of interest there. But I think we have to be very clear here that if we're using stock price to value Manchester United, then it's around 3.2 billion. If we're using financial insiders, then twice the Chelsea sale price is deemed to be fantastic value. And Chelsea ended up selling for 2.3 billion. You might hear 2.5 billion in some quarters, but it dropped at the last minute during the process of due diligence. So if we go with 2.3 billion, 4.6 billion would be deemed by financial insiders familiar with multiple takeovers as excellent value for the Glazers. So you can understand why Sheikh Jassim and Sir Jim Ratcliffe are sticking to the valuation and staying under this 5 billion. And on that 5 billion, again, conflicting reports out there, can only give you my understanding, which is 5 billion by any party has not been hit. It's more like 4.5 billion. I've been asking around to those familiar with the process and obviously trying to talk to people very close to the groups as well. And most are of the belief that it is that ballpark of double the Chelsea price. So if we're calling double the Chelsea price 4.6 billion, then the offers are still well below 5 billion. And coming back to what I said before about transfers, when people hear 4.5 billion and the Glazers want 6, they'll naturally say, well, can't they just settle at 5 or 5.5 billion? But this isn't a transfer where I'm offering you 4.5 million and you're saying, can you go up to 5 million? And that's not, in football terms, a lot of money. If you're jumping up by that incremental in billions from 4.5 to 6, that's 1.5 billion. That's a massive amount of money. And you have to justify that. And Qatar's point on their valuation, and it's the same with Sir Jim Ratcliffe as well, is they want a return on investment. Now, what might make Qatar be prepared to pay more is their return on investment isn't only about the finances. They want to be able to use the vehicle of Manchester United for a variety of different things. Their critics would call it sports washing, but Qatar have got a Vision 2030, which has a sports strategy. And that sports strategy is also about promoting tourism, bringing more high-level sport to Qatar, piggybacking off sports brands, and generally making money and generating exposure without a reliance on the oil and gas sector. So a lot of buying Manchester United is about an ambitious strategy, and QSI with PSG and Braga have done this as well. And when you know, as a developing country like Qatar, a rich one, but evolving in the context of things like sport and entertainment, they're still building new property. They're still bringing new sport over. They're not as established as the United Kingdom in these kind of areas. And as a result, having Manchester United can help. And if that gives you a return on investment far beyond just sport, you might be prepared to pay more, even if you think that you're not going to get an imminent return. And then as they do that due diligence, they'll work out what's the return if they redevelop Old Trafford and Carrington. How does it make any difference if they get in the Champions League this season? What happens if they do 10 consecutive seasons in the Champions League? What will that do to the books? And all of these things will be looked at in detail to find out what is actually value. And for Qatar, even though it is a rich group, they're not just going to throw money for pure vanity. And even though I'm saying Qatar, I should stress very clearly that the Qatari side don't see this as a Qatar bid in the sense of government. And we as journalists have to have scrutiny over it. And it's quite clear that the decision to bid has been blessed by the Emir and also Nasser Al Khalifi. But there's kind of two parts to the bid. There were the consultations to actually make the bid and create the vehicle. And that involved a lot of different stakeholders like QIA, QSI, the Emir, Nasser Al Khalifi. But then after everyone's agreed how we're going to do it and who's going to do it, those stakeholders step away, which means although there's that endorsement from them, this is now being very much seen as Sheikh Jassim and the 9-2 Foundation, and it's his bid, not a Qatar bid. And those listening may say that's nonsense, and there's clearly going to be government influence, and there's clearly going to be a bigger picture. And I would agree with you, you're absolutely right. But the reason why it's being said as Sheikh Jassim's bid, not Qatar's bid, is because the narrative is starting of this has separation. This entity is not going to be a problem for UEFA. It's not going to be a problem for the Premier League owners and directors test. It's not being backed by a sovereign wealth fund, financially speaking. And all of that is significant towards starting to create from this very early stage a kind of PR, whether true or not, around it's Sheikh Jassim. He's a Manchester United fan. He's a private investor, private entity. He's doing it because he's always supported Manchester United. He's even doing it against the backing of his father, who's now said on record that he doesn't see much sense in investing in a club like Manchester United. And then you have this almost like for like of Jim Ratcliffe, Manchester United fan, Sheikh Jassim, Manchester United fan, two groups that claim they won't have conflict with UEFA, two groups that are prepared to buy 100% of the club, two groups that are prepared to invest in the women's team and redevelop the stadium. So it's a bit more personal now. And I think that was the desire of Qatar, to show it was an individual, which is why they went public. Otherwise, there'd be too much speculation about who was behind it, and that would have been to their detriment, I think. And on top of that, they want to show that this is ultimately about a business investment. It's not a vanity project. So we're going to have to wait and see on price. But I think the first consideration is around the Glazers themselves, because whereas Jim Ratcliffe is a bit more flexible, Sheikh Jassim is not going to stick around if his only option is minority. So if the Glazers turn around to Sheikh Jassim and say, we've got another minority investor, but we really like your bid as well. We've decided we only want to entertain minority investment, and therefore you can have 20% or nothing. Sheikh Jassim will say nothing. He wants 100% of the club or nothing. And I guess the last thing I would say with the Glazers is, let's see how the fan influence impacts things, because they may be quite narcissistic and delusional in the sense of presuming that if they get in the Champions League, they win a Premier League, they succeed on the field under Erik ten Hag, they redevelop Old Trafford, that flash forwards 5 years and somehow everyone will love them and apologise to them. And I think most Manchester United fans would say no chance. And if Manchester United win anything, it will be Ten Hag that gets the credit. But the distaste for the Glazers off the back of the Super League as well will always be there, which means that they're not going to be able to win a popularity contest, whatever they do. And the more the club succeeds and the more that they're in the public eye as both a football club and a brand, and the more silverware they win, as we saw at the League Cup final, the more the Glazers are going to have to start being seen and more transparent if they to stay. And even when Manchester United started what felt like a new era off the back of beating Barcelona, seeing off Newcastle in the League Cup final, it was still dominated by anti-Glazers chants. And I think that says it all. So are they going to get the message? And how much of the furore around wanting them out is eventually going to impact the decision? And they can't really intimate that at this stage. First of all, because they don't have a collective position as a family. But second of all, because if they let slip to anyone, even their closest advisors, that they know they want to sell outright because it's not tenable anymore running this club with this fan base. The relationship's broken and it's not likely to be fixed anytime soon. But if they intimate that, then they've shown their hand. And then if you're Sheikh Jassim or Sir Jim Ratcliffe, you're even more determined because they're in a corner. If deep down they know they're going to exit because the relationship is broken, and then there is only a few credible outright bidders, those bidders are going to stick to their guns even more so. So the Glazers have to create this dynamic where they could stay, but they could go, where they're open to lots of different options and they want a very high price. And then that means that the bidders don't quite know where they stand. And as long as there remains that skepticism about whether the Glazers will genuinely sell, it's a lot easier for the Glazers, even though it's only one small part of all of this, it's a bit easier for the Glazers to get that higher number.
Thank you for all that information regarding the ownership, and I think for me it really has given me a lot more information regarding who could potentially own Manchester United in the future. A bit more information on the stages as well. So thank you for all that information, Ben, and I'm sure everyone who's watched as well would be really appreciative too. I wanted to touch on a little bit regarding the transfer window coming ahead in the summer, because a lot of people are saying we need this person, we need this person, we need this person, but we're especially knowing that there is a new potential owner in the future. Could that potentially affect the summer transfer window ahead in terms of the amount what's going to be spent?
Massively. I mean, the primary thing that will impact the transfer window is Champions League football. And if Manchester United get that, then you're either going to get a scenario where a new owner is incoming or the Glazers are still there. And if the Glazers are there with Champions League football, I would still expect them to spend, because once the process ends, if the Glazers are still at the club, they can't do what they did in January and dilly-dally and show a lack of ambition due to the uncertainty of their future. And similarly, if a new group comes in, then they'll want to make an impact, much like Todd Boehly and Clearlake Capital did at Chelsea. But everything, even for a new ownership group, will still depend on Champions League football. And it's worth pointing out that financial fair play is in cycles. So just because you get a new owner, it doesn't mean that your budgets start from when that new owner comes in. That new owner can inject money in, but they're still bound by the books that they've inherited, which is why ultimately the due diligence is still such a crucial stage. So once again, you will hear a lot of Qatar have got a war chest for Erik ten Hag. And that may well be true, but they still have to operate within the context of Manchester United's previous and existing cycles, because there'll be some players that are still being amortized on the books. There'll be long-standing bonuses and wage structures that affect a variety of things. And of course, they'll be walking in with a bunch of promises made and also costs that they're bound by, that they ultimately haven't been able to control. But that said, there's always some flexibility, and Manchester United won't just have incomings in the summer, there will be outgoings as well. And when you get an outgoing in a transfer window, unlike an incoming that you can amortize, as long as there's nothing left on the amortization, it's all pure profit. And that can be offset in an individual year, and it makes your books look a lot healthier. So to give you an example, because people may not listening understand the amortization, when Chelsea are signing all these players on a long-term contract, it allows them to divide the transfer fee by the length of contract. So if it's a 7-year contract, then that's 7 into the fee, which means the year-on-year cost is a lot lower. If Chelsea then sell Conor Gallagher for 40 million, then minus any amortization for the player remaining, it's all straight profit on that same year, which means that if Mudryk, and I'm just estimating these figures now so we don't linger over another club for too long, but if Mudryk's costing Chelsea 7 million, Enzo Fernandez is costing 9 million and so on, then by selling a 40 million player, you're actually up on that year, even though potentially you've brought in 3 or 4 and only sold 1. And it's the same for Manchester United, that there may be some concerns over financial fair play, not in the sense of getting fined or punished, but just making sure that they are prudent, because there have been seasons without Champions League football. So the outgoings can be very important as well. And then with the incomings, I think that with Champions League football, Manchester United are going to be very ambitious, in my opinion. And we know that they want a traditional number 9. So Victor Osimhen is a player that everyone at the club likes. Harry Kane is being linked as well. But I've said many times since October, Kane's priority will be to sign a new deal at Spurs if he can. But if the project really goes wrong, and there's already uncertainty over Antonio Conte, and if Tottenham don't make the top 4, you just never know. But I think that Kane is quite difficult, because you've not only got to convince him to leave Spurs, but you've also got to negotiate with Daniel Levy as well. And he's older than Victor Osimhen too. So Osimhen is the right overall profile. But Kane walks straight into any Premier League side and is a difference maker. So we wait and see whether there's any possibility for either of them. I still think Kane is difficult and it's premature at this stage because Manchester United haven't advanced anything, but the interest is real. With Osimhen, his dreams to play in the Premier League, and that will definitely give suitors like Manchester United and Chelsea some hope. But Napoli are flying. They're on a procession to win Serie A. I think they're 18 points clear at the top. They're genuine Champions League contenders this season. So let's see whether they can persuade Osimhen to stay for another season. He's been at the club, though, now for 3 seasons. So that one is a realistic possibility for sure. And then Tammy Abraham's been linked as well. And one of those where Manchester United like him, but not necessarily the top target at this stage, but might be a budget option and a more feasible option compared to the other 2 that I've mentioned. So that traditional number 9 is going to be really important. And then I think that Manchester United will look at a right back as well, even though Diego Dalot is obviously phenomenal. They'll still want some cover or competition there. And then I think that there's a variety of positions that will be informed by outgoings as well. So we wait and see what happens with Harry Maguire. Scott McTominay is a player that Newcastle have been tracking over the course of the last 2 windows as well. So where does Eric Ten Hag strengthen based on who he loses? Anthony Martial will be linked with a variety of people as well. And then obviously when you factor in on top of all of that, the club's desire to extend Marcus Rashford, and they're confident in that as well. He's in the form of his life. You have this very busy summer where Manchester United are going to have overhaul. And if they make Champions League football and if they have a new owner, I would expect them to be very ambitious in the market, quite big spending in the market, but also need a fair amount of outgoings as well in order to keep their squad size down and make sure, in addition to that, that they bring in a little bit of income. And the last thing to understand as well, and it'd be interesting to see if this changed under any new owner, is that the difference, and Chelsea are moving in this direction, but the difference between Chelsea and Manchester United is that Manchester United have always had this incentive-driven aspect into the wage bill, which has protected them when they've not made Champions League football. And you may remember that when Cristiano Ronaldo left, one of his disappointments was that he'd scored 18 Premier League goals and he had to take a wage reduction into the next season because that was blanket across the club due to the fact that they hadn't made Champions League football. And Ronaldo felt, even though he knew about that clause, that his form in the previous season was good enough that it was a point of contention. And that type of thing can be very useful to a club because if things don't go according to plan, you're saving on the finances and everybody collectively on the playing side is kind of taking a hit. Now, everyone's contract is different. Some people want exceptions. Some people are able to not agree to things that most of the squad have. But generally, Manchester United have been quite good at having an equality around bonuses and reductions. Whereas Chelsea, before this new regime, had none of that. So everyone stayed on a Champions League wage, whether they were Premier League winners or whether they were 10th in the table. And then in that season, when you are not in the Champions League, but you're paying that Champions League wage, it's a massive hit on your books, potentially. And then if you don't get Champions League in back-to-back seasons, you start to be in a really difficult position. So a new owner may decide heading into the window that they want to change the structure of the wage bill and make it incentive driven. They might want to bring down the average age. They might want to bring down the wage bill. They might want to drop some of the reductions and reward the team and say, actually, it's a statement of our intent that we're not going to remove whatever percentage of your wage if we don't make Champions League football. It remains to be seen because they've not thought about it in that kind of detail yet. They're only really trying to get in at the football club with a very broad strategy. And then once they actually succeed, or if they succeed, these are the kind of conversations that they'll have. So it's a little bit premature to be talking about numbers simply because we don't know yet who's even going to win. But what's clear is that with Champions League football in particular, the thing that the Glazers, Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Qatar has in common is that they want to be ambitious in terms of spending over the summer, because they know if Manchester United are moving in the right direction, have silverware already this season, and make Champions League, that it can't be an oscillation whereby you take one step forwards, two steps back, which we might see from Spurs this season. It has to be Manchester United on a clear path where they're back to default Champions League season after season, default trophies season after season. And that is going to require big spend and overhaul. And clearly Qatar and Sir Jim Ratcliffe claim they've got that appetite. We have to wait and see what the Glazers do, and if they put their money where their mouth is, should they stay at the football club. But sources close to Manchester United are saying, as you would expect them to at this stage, that were the Glazers to stay, the whole point of minority investment is to provide that type of cash injection to allow them to be ambitious as well. So it won't be good news for Manchester United fans if the Glazers stay, but financially speaking, it shouldn't be a disaster whatever happens. Any type of investment on the football side, at least come summer, will be very positive to the football club. Even if the Glazers stay, the fan base will be in relative outrage, I would have thought, because they just want rid of them.
Yeah, I think it definitely will be outrage if the Glazers was to stay from the fan base. And going back on to transfers, because I know you already touched on a right back. I know a lot of people have been shouting out about a midfielder, and one what comes to mind and what Ten Hag admires is Frankie de Jong.
Yeah, Frankie de Jong, probably not a possibility, because he's always said that he wants to stay at Barcelona. His position hasn't really changed. I think there's two aspects here. One is the summer saga, and the other is de Jong perhaps having an allure to the Premier League, but ultimately Barcelona being his priority. And what we find as journalists is sometimes we're quoted out of context. Like last summer, I said that if Frankie de Jong was to be forced out of the club, with forced being the key word, because Barcelona needed to reduce their costs, then a Premier League move would be very possible. But the player was always very consistent. He wanted to stay at Barcelona. That never changed throughout the whole of the summer, and it hasn't changed now. So it's going to be very difficult for Manchester United to get Frankie de Jong in the short term. And actually, at the point when Manchester United were really pushing earlier in the summer, the player was not overly sold. So now it's going to be intriguing, because Manchester United have changed a little bit. He's seen where the project's developed. Cristiano Ronaldo's gone. The dressing room's a bit more unified. Casemiro's come in, and obviously, apart from unfortunately getting sent off a couple of times, has done phenomenal. Has been one of the best signings of the season. So players perhaps that judged Manchester United in a state of flux are now starting to look and see what the vision is. And that might make a difference in the long term. But I don't think anything will be possible for Manchester United and Frankie de Jong in the summer unless there's a dramatic U-turn from his position, which is he loves Barcelona. And it's not just the football club either. He loves Xavi, the manager. He enjoys the dressing room. And on top of that, he loves living in the city as well. And footballers are ultimately humans. And some of them make their decisions based on money. Some of them make their decisions based on prestige. Some of them make their decisions based on coaches. Some of them make their decisions based on their family. Some of them prefer a certain food or a climate. And for many of them, it's a little bit of everything. And for whatever reason, Frankie de Jong is intrigued by the Premier League, but fully sold and committed to Barcelona at this point. So then we're going to have to wait and see who else Manchester United can add in this area. They are not serious contenders at this point for Jude Bellingham, with Manchester City and Liverpool and Real Madrid more likely, and Chelsea kind of bubbling somewhere in the background, but to no great charge or degree at this stage. A lot can change. Obviously, we're in very early stages, but you've got to put in the legwork for that kind of player. Declan Rice, player that Manchester United have liked for a while, but Arsenal and Chelsea are thought to be the front runners. And the reason for that is because, a bit like what I said a moment ago, Rice just really likes living in London and has spoken glowingly about Mikel Arteta. So I sense that Arsenal are front runners, but Chelsea are still very much in that race as well. Edson Alvarez at Ajax is another one to watch, a player that Erik ten Hag really likes. Chelsea tried to sign him towards the end of the summer window, and he even didn't show up for training on the last day of the window to try and force a move, but Ajax were not prepared to sanction it, so he stayed, and Chelsea haven't come back in for him. Very much the type of player that Erik ten Hag appreciates and knows well. So that type of profile is one to watch too. And obviously, Manchester United need to resolve in that midfield as well, whether they're prepared to let Scott McTominay go. And if so, then there'll be even more need and urgency in order to strengthen in the centre of the park. So I think that a central midfielder is one, but to what sort of position and degree? And this is why so many people like Bellingham, because as he shows for England, he can sit deeper and play with Declan Rice in a 2, or he can move further forwards as an attacking midfielder or a number 10. And when you have that versatility to be really dynamic, to get box to box, to play in an advanced role, or to be more disciplined, it ticks a lot of boxes. And I think Manchester United need to look and work out, based on who stays and what they've got, as to whether it's a specialist DM or whether it's an old school central midfielder, box to box, or whether it's more of an attacking midfielder. And a lot of that, I think, will be informed not just by who they want and who they think they can get and is available on the market, but who might depart as well. And then it's obvious that that traditional number 9 is needed, even if Manchester United went back to Burnley. They don't have an option in the loan, but if they went back to Burnley and said, we want to buy Wout Weghorst, he would still only be a squad player. It wouldn't paper over the fact that Manchester United need a out-and-out traditional forward, which is why they're being linked with the names that we discussed before. And then right back is just about cover, and it's centre back. There's plenty of cover, but you know, how many of the centre backs, but particularly Maguire, that are not playing regularly, are happy with their role in the squad? And if players asked to leave or Manchester United get the right offers in, are they going to look to make any more defensive reinforcements as well? So I would say 3 or 4 seems quite logical for Manchester United over the summer, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's 3 or 4 relatively high-profile outgoings as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for the conversation, Ben. Thank you for giving us an update regarding the potential new ownership, a little bit about the transfer window as well. It's been absolutely great talking to you.
Absolute pleasure. Keep up the good work, and good luck to Manchester United for the rest of the season. Let's hope that the takeover process provides clarity soon, and Manchester United continue to solidify their place in the top 4, and who knows, maybe add another trophy or 2 as well.
Fingers crossed. I think we'd all love another trophy. Hopefully FA Cup or Europa League, you never know. But thank you very much, for the best of luck, and thank you very, very much for taking the time.
All the best. Good to come on. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.